Jerusalem was a city vibrating at a frequency that made the teeth ache. The air hung thick with the scent of roasting lamb, and the dry, metallic dust kicked up by thousands of sandals on stone. It was the season of Passover, but the usual rhythm had fractured. Every street corner held a knot of men whispering, their eyes darting toward the temple gates. The marketplace was a cacophony of shouting merchants and bleating livestock. Yet beneath the noise, a strange, heavy stillness pressed down from the sky. People moved with a frantic, jerky energy, as if they were all waiting for a clock to strike an hour they could not name. The sun began to dip behind the western hills, casting long, jagged shadows across the limestone walls. The wind died down, leaving the city in a sudden, breathless hush. It was not the peace of rest, but the silence of a held breath. The city felt it in the cooling stone, in the darkening alleys, and in the way the crowds began to thin, retreating into the shadows. Away from the frantic pulse of the marketplace, a narrow staircase led upward into a space that seemed untouched by the city's fever. The door clicked shut, muffling the distant murmur of the streets until it was nothing more than a ghost of sound. Inside, the room was cool, smelling of dry wood and the faint, lingering scent of oil lamps. 12 men moved through the doorway, one by one. Their footsteps were muted against the stone floor. They did not speak. Each man carried the weight of the day in the slump of his shoulders. In the center of the room, a long wooden table waited. It was simple, unadorned, and stark in the dim light. They took their places, pulling back benches with a slow, deliberate scrape that echoed too loudly in the sudden quiet. The elements were already set. Rounds of unleavened bread, dark wine in clay cups, and the sharp, clean scent of bitter herbs. The silence here was different from the city. It was not the silence of waiting, but of profound, heavy solemnity. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, and the room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Jesus stepped inside. He did not rush, but his presence filled the space, drawing every eye toward him. He walked to the head of the table, his footsteps steady against the stone. He stopped and looked at each man in turn. His gaze was not a casual glance. It held a weight that made the disciples shift in their seats, their hands gripping the edge of the wood. He stood there for a long moment, the silence deepening until it felt like a physical pressure. Then, he spoke. His voice was calm, yet it carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pool. A ripple of confusion broke across the faces of the men. They exchanged quick, darting glances, their brows furrowed in sudden, sharp bewilderment. Suffer? The word hung in the air, clashing with the festive nature of the meal. They leaned in, searching his face for a sign, but found only a steady, quiet resolve. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an unspoken significance. The silence in the room was absolute, until Jesus stood. The movement was fluid, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. He moved to the corner of the room, his actions precise. He reached for his outer layer, unfastening it with steady hands, and set it aside. Then, he took a length of fabric and wrapped it firmly around his waist. The disciples watched, their bodies stiffening, their eyes tracking every motion. He did not look at them. He walked to the basin, the stone floor cool beneath his feet. He reached for the heavy clay pitcher, the weight of it evident in the way he gripped the handle. He tipped it. The water hit the basin with a sharp, clear splash that echoed against the stone walls, cutting through the heavy air. The sound was too loud, too sudden, and it broke the remaining tension. He poured until the basin was full, the surface of the water shimmering in the low light. He set the pitcher down with a soft thud. He stood there for a heartbeat, his back to the table, his hands resting on the edge of the basin. The disciples remained motionless, their breath held. Jesus turned. He did not look at the table, but walked directly to the nearest man. He moved with a quiet, focused grace that made the air feel thin. Without a word, he lowered himself, His knees hit the stone floor with a soft, dull sound. The disciples leaned forward, their hands gripping the table edge until their knuckles turned white. He reached out, his hands steady, and took the first man's foot. He dipped his fingers into the basin, the water swirling around his knuckles, and began to wipe away the grit of the road. The man whose foot he held drew in a sharp, jagged breath, his body jolting as if struck. Jesus ignored the reaction. He worked with a calm, methodical precision, scrubbing the dust from between the toes and across the heel. The water in the basin darkened as the grime of their long journey dissolved into the liquid. He did not look up. His focus was entirely on the task. He moved to the next man, then the next, his presence a constant, grounding weight on the floor. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic, soft splashing of water and the sound of his breathing. Each man sat frozen, unable to look away, their faces masks of disbelief. The hierarchy they had lived by the teacher above the student, the master above the servant, was being dismantled in the dirt on the floor. He was not just cleaning them. He was changing the very ground they stood upon. The rhythmic splashing slowed as Jesus moved toward the end of the table. He reached the place where Simon Peter sat, his hands still wet, the towel heavy with the grime of the others. Peter watched him approach, his body coiled, his gaze darting from the basin to the face of the man kneeling before him. As Jesus reached out to take his ankle, Peter jerked his leg back, pulling his feet beneath the bench. The movement was sharp, a sudden fracture in the stillness of the room. Peter leaned forward, his hands pressing hard against the wood of the table. He stared down at the bowed head, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "Lord," he began, his voice raspy and thin, "are you going to wash my feet?" He did not wait for an answer, his frustration mounting with every passing second. He looked around at the others, seeking some sign of shared outrage, but found only the same stunned silence. He turned back, his eyes wide, his brow furrowed in deep, jagged lines of bewilderment. The air between them felt thick, charged with friction. Jesus did not pull back. He kept his hand steady, palm open, waiting for the resistance to fade. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Peter with a clarity that seemed to strip away the noise of the room. The air grew heavy, pressing against the walls. "You do not realize now what I am doing," Jesus said, his voice low and resonant. "But later you will understand." Peter shook his head, his jaw set in a hard line of stubborn refusal. He pulled his feet further back, his heels digging into the floorboards. "No," Peter snapped, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus stood, his presence filling the space between them. He leaned in, his expression unyielding. "Unless I wash you," he said, "you have no part with me." Peter froze. The defiance drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, hollow shock. The fight had left him. The silence in the room stretched, thin and brittle. Peter stared at the basin, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged rhythms. The threat of being cast out, of losing his place at the side of the man he followed, eclipsed every ounce of his pride. His face flushed, the skin tightening as the reality of his own words took hold. He did not look at the others. He looked only at the water. His hands, previously white-knuckled against the table, suddenly flew forward, palms open, reaching toward the man before him. "Then, Lord," Peter gasped, his voice cracking. The earlier defiance replaced by a frantic, desperate urgency. "Not just my feet." He leaned forward, his head bowing, his neck exposed in a gesture of total vulnerability. "My hands and my head as well." He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles straining, his eyes wide and fixed on the basin. He was no longer the man who had pulled away. He waited, his breathing shallow, his body trembling with the intensity of his plea. He held his breath, waiting for the touch that would bind him back. Jesus reached out, his hands steady and gentle as he touched Peter. He did not wash his head or hands, but he met Peter's frantic gaze with a soft, knowing smile that seemed to see through the desperation to the man underneath. "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet," Jesus said, his voice calm, washing away the last of the tension. Their whole body is clean. He stood, the water dripping from his fingers, and turned back toward the table. The room was quiet, the only sound, the soft intake of breath from the men watching. Jesus paused, his posture still, his gaze sweeping slowly across the faces of the 12. He looked at each one, lingering for a heartbeat, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And you are clean," he said, his voice dropping, the resonance vibrating in the stillness. "Though not every one of you." The air in the room shifted instantly. The warmth of the moment evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp chill. The disciples looked at one another, their expressions tightening, a tremor of unease rippling through the group. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with a sudden, creeping dread. Jesus moved back to the head of the table, his steps deliberate on the stone floor. He sat, the wood creaking under his weight, and placed his hands flat on the surface. The basin sat at his feet, a small, wet reminder of the humility he had just performed. He looked at the men, his expression unyielding, his eyes searching their faces one by one. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. His voice was steady, cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the room. He did not wait for an answer, his gaze probing, demanding their attention. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am." He leaned forward, the shadows in the room deepening around him. "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet." The command hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. He paused, letting the instruction settle, watching as the disciples shifted in their seats, their eyes darting away from his. "I have set you an example," he continued, his tone dropping into a low, resonant finality, "that you should do as I have done for you." A profound silence reclaimed the room, heavier than before. The men sat motionless, the weight of his words pressing down on them, forcing each to look inward. No one dared to break the stillness. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until it seemed ready to snap. Jesus remained at the head of the table, his hands resting motionless upon the wood. Then the change began. It was not a movement of limbs, but a sudden, sharp alteration in his presence. A shadow seemed to pass over his face, drawing the features tight. His jaw set, and his eyes, previously steady and calm, clouded with a profound internal ache. He drew a long, slow breath, his chest rising and falling with a visible, heavy effort. The disciples noticed it immediately. The man who had just served them with such quiet grace was now gripped by a different, darker intensity. He looked away from them, his gaze fixing on a point in the distance, his brow furrowed, as if reading a script written in the air. His shoulders slumped slightly, burdened by a weight that had nothing to do with the physical room. The air grew cold, the earlier sense of solemn instruction replaced by a creeping, sharp-edged sorrow. He did not look at them now. He looked through them. His lips parted, then closed, as he wrestled with the words he was about to release. The 11 sat frozen, their own breath held, watching the master. The words finally broke from his lips, low and jagged. "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." The effect was immediate. The air in the room seemed to shatter. The disciples did not move at first, frozen by the sheer impossibility of the claim. Then, the shock took hold. Simon Peter pushed his chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the stone floor. His eyes darted from Jesus to the men beside him, searching for a sign, a tremor, anything. One by one, they began to speak, their voices overlapping in a frantic, rising chorus. "Surely you do not mean me, Lord?" one asked, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. Another leaned forward, his face pale, his brow slick with sudden sweat. "Is it me?" they demanded, the question echoing against the walls. They looked at each other now, not with the camaraderie of the evening, but with a sharp, sudden suspicion. The unity of the room had evaporated. Each man turned inward, frantically retracing his own steps, his own thoughts, his own loyalty, desperate to prove his innocence to the master. The frantic voices faltered, then died away as Jesus raised a single hand. The room fell into a silence so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against their ears. He did not look at the men surrounding him. His gaze, steady and devoid of hesitation, fixed on a specific point across the table. He reached for a piece of bread, his fingers moving with deliberate, measured grace. The sound of his hand brushing against the wooden bowl was loud in the stillness. He lifted the bread, held it for a heartbeat, and then submerged it into the communal dish. The liquid rippled, a small, dark disturbance in the center of the table. He withdrew the bread, now darkened by the sauce, and held it suspended in the air. Every eye in the room followed his hand. He did not turn his head, nor did he blink. He extended his arm, his fingers steady, and placed the bread directly into the hand of Judas Iscariot. The movement was final. It was a bridge built and crossed in a single motion. Judas sat motionless, the bread heavy in his palm, while the others watched, their breath caught in their throats. The air turned cold, thick with the sudden, undeniable weight of the truth. The connection was made, the identity revealed, and the space between them seemed to widen. The room held its breath, a collective stillness that made the sound of a single candle flickering feel like a thunderclap. Judas did not look at the others. He kept his head bowed, his fingers tightening around the piece of bread. Jesus leaned forward, the movement slow and deliberate, and the space between them seemed to collapse. He did not speak to the group. He did not acknowledge the confusion etched into the faces of the 11. He looked only at Judas. The intensity of that gaze was a physical weight, forcing the disciple to finally lift his eyes. In that moment, the mask of the follower slipped. Jesus held his stare, his expression unyielding, his eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow that bordered on the infinite. "What you are about to do quickly." The words were not a request. They were a release, a final severance of the cord that had bound them. Around the table, the others shifted, their brows furrowed in genuine bewilderment. They heard the words, but the meaning remained locked. Judas did not respond. He did not offer a defense, nor did he look toward the others. He simply pushed his chair back. The sound of wood scraping against the stone floor was sharp, a jarring intrusion into the suffocating quiet. He stood, his movements mechanical and devoid of hesitation. The 11 watched him, their mouths slightly parted, confusion still clouding their eyes. They reached out, a hand hovering in the air, but the words died in their throats. Judas walked toward the doorway, his stride steady, his gaze fixed on the threshold. He passed through the space where the light from the room met the shadows of the corridor. He did not pause. He did not look back. He stepped across the threshold, his presence vanishing into the gloom beyond. The heavy wooden door remained open for a heartbeat, framing the darkness outside. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it swung shut. The latch clicked into place with a final, metallic snap that resonated against the walls. The sound echoed, lingering in the air like an irreversible sentence. The room felt suddenly smaller, the space where he had sat now empty and cold. The latch remained silent, but the air in the room felt thinner, as if the departure had drained the vitality from the space. Outside the heavy door, the city of Jerusalem had surrendered to the deep, suffocating blackness of the night. There was no moon to guide the path. The shadows beyond the threshold were absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the very concept of direction. Judas moved into that darkness, his figure blurring and then dissolving entirely into the gloom. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. His footsteps, initially audible against the stone, were quickly muffled by the thick, damp air of the alleyways. The night was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a cold shroud that draped over the city and signaled the start of a long, inevitable descent. The 11 disciples remained seated, their eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. Yet their focus drifted past the wood and stone to the emptiness outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp and lonely, cutting through the stillness like a blade. The night had claimed its own. The heavy silence that followed the latching door did not remain empty for long. It began to vibrate with a different frequency. The oppressive weight of the betrayal seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp, electric clarity that settled over the room like a sudden change in pressure. Jesus remained seated for a moment, his hands resting flat upon the wood of the table. He did not look toward the door. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes sweeping across the remaining 11. The flickering candlelight caught the planes of his face, revealing a composure that had not been there moments before. He stood, and the movement was fluid, deliberate, and entirely unburdened. The air in the room, previously thick with the scent of stale wine and fear, now felt crisp, as if a window had been opened to a distant, unseen horizon. The disciples watched him, their confusion giving way to a strange, quiet awe. He was no longer the man who had knelt to wash their feet. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the walls of the room, his posture radiating a singular, unwavering focus. The dread had been purged. Jesus did not look back at the empty chair where the betrayer had sat. He stood at the head of the table, his hands open, palms upward, as if holding the weight of the world and finding it light. When he spoke, his voice carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. "Now the Son of Man is glorified," he said, and the words landed with the finality of a gavel. To the 11, the night had been a sequence of losses, but to him, it was the opening of a gate. He spoke of glory, not as a distant reward, but as a current reality. The confusion that had clouded their faces began to fracture, replaced by a dawning, bewildered realization. He paced the length of the table, "And God is glorified in him," he added, his gaze sweeping over them, steady and piercing. The air in the room grew warm. The disciples sat motionless, as the shadow of the cross was suddenly eclipsed by the brightness of a purpose they were only beginning to see. The resonance of his words lingered in the air, but the sharp edge of authority began to dull, replaced by a profound, quiet warmth. Jesus leaned forward, his hands resting gently on the table. He looked at each of them in turn, not as a leader addressing a crowd, but as a friend holding the gaze of those he cherished. The tension that had tightened their chests throughout the night began to dissolve under the steady, calm focus of his eyes. He did not speak again, yet the silence was no longer heavy with dread or confusion. It was a bridge of stillness. He held their attention, his expression open and entirely at peace, anchoring them against the rising tide of the coming storm. The 11 watched him, their own breathing slowing to match his steady rhythm. They felt the weight of the night recede, replaced by a strange, quiet assurance that remained even as the shadows lengthened. The room felt smaller, more intimate, a sanctuary carved out of the darkness. He remained there, a steady light in the center of the room, until the final image of his calm, purposeful face became the only thing that mattered.